Hi, everyone. Welcome to a podcast brought to you by the teams at JetRails, One-to-One E-commerce, and nChannel. We're really glad to have some great guests with us today to talk about best practices for Magento data management. In essence, how to get your data in and out of your Magento store. With us today, I'll start by welcoming Ryan Lunka. Ryan, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've got a long history. I was a consultant before I was at nChannel, primarily implementing digital marketing and content management systems in the Adobe ecosystem for big enterprise companies. Sometimes there's some e-commerce companies, some other things as well. Came to nChannel as the digital marketing director, have been the head of product for about 3 years, and now I'm the chief operating officer overseeing basically all of our operations from sales, marketing, development, and implementation. We do a lot of integration for retailers and e-commerce merchants, including a lot of Magento merchants, connecting Magento to things like point of sale systems and suppliers through flat file integration and ERPs and things like that. So we've done a lot of work with Magento, and hopefully we'll have a lot to offer here.
Awesome. And as well, we've got Chris from the One-to-One e-commerce team. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, I've been a developer for 11 years now. I am currently working on One-to-One e-commerce. I am a technical leader there. I also a certified Magento front-end and back-end programmer. My goal in the company is getting my team to get the better solution for all the problems that appears. One-to-one e-commerce does migration from Magento 1 to Magento 2, does maintenance, save sites that are beyond repair sometimes, those are the worst. And getting the best solution for every problem is basically my work.
Awesome. And this is Robert, one of the co-hosts of the JetRails podcast. And I've been a Magento 1 and 2 solution specialist for some time. I've helped to oversee the builds and migrations of various Magento sites for many years, and currently oversee partnerships and alliances at JetRails, a mission-critical white glove e-commerce host. So with no further ado, let's dive right in. I'll take you through the quick agenda for the day. We're going to be talking about some of the background of the Magento database itself, some of the methods of getting data in and out, including working direct to database, working with file import and export, as well as using Magento's APIs. And we're going to go into some of the pros and cons of some of these different methods, because there are use cases for each, some more than others, perhaps. We'll find out soon. And with that, let's talk a little bit about Magento's database. Ryan, do you want to give us a little bit of perspective from your background on working with Magento?
Yeah, the Magento database is very challenging. It's very big and complicated. When you want to pull data out of a system in bulk, and you have pretty custom ways you need to do it, the database can be a great way to pull the data out. But you have to really understand the structure of Magento's database and the patterns that it uses to break out how all the data is stored, and that can be a little bit complex.
Yes, so one of those patterns is the EAV pattern that I use for the attributes specifically, and that has a huge number of tables that work together in order to let the customer create new attributes with different types of attributes. And handling that in MySQL is very hard to get it done, basically, and it's fragile. So if you put data in that Magento is not prepared to handle, it will crash, and we can generate problems in the future.
Yeah, and if you think about it in simplest terms, if you have one spreadsheet with all of your data in it, you're not really working with with Magento data, because the way that the data relates in terms of the database, you've got separate tables that relate to the products, the attributes, the orders, the customers, shipping, payments, all interlocking and interrelated. So if you were to, let's say, insert shipping, it's going to relate to an order, to a customer, if you were to be inserting data that relates to products that's going to interrelate with attributes and perhaps with existing orders. And so it does add a little bit of complexity, and perhaps that's why we chose this for today's topic. And so let's dive right in on reading and writing data. Obviously we've talked about the fact that there are multiple ways of doing it right from the offset. Any major preferences, and we'll see where we wind up by the end of today's conversation. But, let me start off with Chris. Do you prefer one method if you have a choice?
If I have a choice, I would go with the API connection. The rest seems having problems, and we're going to dig into those, I think.
Awesome. And Ryan, what would you say on the topic?
I would generally lean toward API. That's typically how at nChannel we're moving data across systems we prefer to work. There are reasons you would make other decisions, but your default should probably be to try to do data movement through the API.
Yeah, awesome. And so given that I think we're all fans of the API methodology for getting data in and out, let's start right off by talking about going direct to the database. And we do know that there are some pros, there are some cons. Chris, why don't you start us off with some of your thoughts from your experience on working with the database?
Well, as a pro for directly inserting into the Magento database, it can be useful because it's very fast. People are very used to use MySQL queries to solve problems. And when you have a problem in live or something that needs to be fixed urgently, you might need to do something in the database, meaning removing something or inserting something that is missing. And you have absolute control over what you do. What you do is what you see, basically, in this type of importing data. The cons can be that Magento database, like we said, is very fragile, and inserting data this way, because of the relational nature of the database, can create data inconsistency in the long term. Maybe you don't see at that time, but in the future, as the site is working live, you will get to see what you've done there, and it can generate problems in that respect. So if you have processes that process the data previously to insert to the database, like I don't know, in Magento we call them plugins or observers that change the data before they got inserted. If you directly insert that data into the database, we will bypassing that, and you won't get the same data result that Magento will get if you do it using Magento directly.
And Ryan, anything to add to that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. In terms of inserting data, you better have an emergency situation and have somebody who really knows what they're doing, because the risk often outweighs the reward trying to insert data into the database. It can be useful if you need to do like large-scale ETL type transactions where you have to get a lot of data out fairly efficiently to drop it off to, maybe you're migrating instances, or you want to drop it off to a data warehouse or something like that. Because there's a little bit less risk when you're reading. You just have to, it's complex to write the queries, but once you write them, the overall hit on your server or the risk to your data is pretty minimal. So there's reasons you could potentially want to do that, especially if the API on primarily Magento 1 doesn't really provide you the information that you need necessarily.
Also, there are certain entities that are easier to interact because they don't have many relations. Like in Magento, it can be like in these pages, in these logs. I think they have two tables that relate to each other. One is for the store, one is for the data, for each one. And those don't represent a big issue dealing directly with them. When you get to products or orders and customers that they are all interrelated in between them, that is very hard to do.
Oh yeah.
So maybe querying the database a bit safer, especially if done by someone that that's going to keep an eye on their resource usage and such. But inserting data, unless you're working with items like CMS pages and such that don't correlate to too many relational tables, that's where it's going to get dicier.
Yeah.
So let's move over to file import and export, working with flat files like CSV and certainly other file types that Magento can work with. And let's be sure to look at both what Magento natively handles, as well as perhaps adding an extension or some third-party system that'll help to allow for other types of import-export, for instance, importing orders or things like that.
Okay.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to start us off on that one?
I can start. Well, the import-export, if you are doing it for updating attributes or something like that, it's maybe the easiest way, because anyone can do it. It can be done in the backend. It's relatively safe. But the cons of this is, if you have a very large, for example, a very large file to import, it might crash the server like that. Magento, the server won't handle the size of that file. It can happen. Also, it's very buggy, meaning that you will get errors that you don't understand, and they are not very well explained. So it's hard to debug if you go those errors. And it's limited, like you said, it's limited to the entities that Magento allows. But you can create a new export import via creating new extensions, or maybe a third-party extension already created. Mainly those extensions internally will work with API. So if they are done correctly, it's a good way to go.
And Ryan, and obviously nChannel moves a lot of data for a lot of reasons. Where have you seen file import and export really shine?
I kind of echo that there's performance challenges with the import export. I've actually crashed a server trying to do an export before too, which is different than being a little safer when you're reading from the database. Usually the read operation is a little safer. It's great for small batch kind of updates, attributes, things like that. Some of the challenge with it is when you're trying to import CSV data, you're importing a flat data structure, and the data in Magento is fundamentally not flat. So to try to represent the data in a flat structure makes it a little bit difficult to understand what you're necessarily changing, and it's actually limited in what you can do. You can only represent it so many ways. The other challenge here is you can't really automate it unless you add some kind of customization or an app that potentially automates it. So, a lot of what we do is we're integrating data over a long period of time. It's not really a one-time transaction. Picking up orders as close to real time as possible and sending them across, or dropping a product catalog update once a day, and it's all automated. The file import export is really kind of a manual one-time process, and if you want to automate that, you've got to use other means.
Yeah, so you could set a cron job, have things coming in and out, but at the same time, I would resonate that there's potentially, especially if you're using native Magento import-export functionality. Let's say you want to pull in product reviews with your data, or if you're using extensions, perhaps, let's say for, reward points with your customer data, there are going to be things that don't necessarily work as easily for you with what you're going to find. So there are those cases. I would say the most common usage is going to be, either, as I think you've both suggested, simple, product and other data that's going to go in and out, or perhaps for one-time work where it's not worth writing to the API in some situations, and just working with what's already there for an import or an export might make more sense. And certainly I've run into lots of extensions that will add to what you can import and export with flat file. And in some cases, I've seen those used for one-time work just because faster to install an extension, move the data that you need to move, and get on to the next task. But certainly, lots of usage out there. I would ask, has anyone, and maybe Chris, you might have run into this. Have you ever seen any database bloat, any remnants left by some of that importing and such that gets done with flat file? I haven't noticed it in a while.
And I found a lot of those in databases, but I couldn't trace it back to an import per se. It can be anything. at that point. So it can be. I never seen it be directly associated with this type of import, but I wouldn't discard it.
Yeah, all right. So I've got something for you to keep an eye on in the future. We pegged that a few times, especially maybe with some earlier Magento 1 work. And so that leads us into what started off at the beginning of this podcast as the fan favorite, the API integrations. And certainly Magento has had more than one API to choose from historically. Let's start off with Ryan on this one, since nChannel really has an integration to Magento through API and has done a lot of work to support that. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to work with the API and some of those pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, our preference is always to start with an API for a number of reasons. One is it's generally the safest way to get data into and out of a system, because it allows the application to insert into the database and read from the database with business logic and validation rules and all those sorts of things. The challenge with an API is that you have to have either some application or some amount of code that can call the API. That's what our platform does. So for us, it's an obvious answer. But if you're not dealing with a system already that knows how to talk to the API, you have to write scripts or write code to make that happen. You also have to take into consideration how hard you hit the API. If you just blast it with data, you could potentially take down the instance of Magento. So you have to think about those sorts of things if you're dealing with large operations.
Sure, throttling definitely becomes important.
Oh, yeah. And on Magento 1, we had some challenges because the REST API was a little bit limited in what you could do, and we generally prefer a REST API. We had to actually build a plugin to bolt into Magento to add some functionality for like webhook listening, things like that. But the Magento 2 API so far looks pretty robust, and I know our development teams had a really easy time working with it. So if you know REST APIs, they've implemented the Open API standard, so it's very familiar documentation. It's a very familiar interface for talking to. So it's a pretty easy API to work with.
Yeah, and you touched on data validation, and I know we're going to look at a case study momentarily that'll give some insight into that. But going backwards a bit, I'd say that you'd have some of the least data validation going direct to database. You're basically able to shove what you want in there. Going into flat file, things may fail, although it can be really tough to figure out what's failing and where to clean up the data. So if your data isn't pristine in the first place, doesn't match the schema properly for what you're trying to pull into Magento, that'll get a bit dicey. The API, I would say, is the best, that it's going to give you hopefully some kind of useful response and allow you to do what you need to do. Chris, what would you think on some of that data validation?
Yeah, and the best thing about the API is that handle the data the way that Magento handles the data. So it passes through all the validation that it will pass if you create a product in the backend, for example, on an order, or you change the status of an order. Everything passes like it is done inside Magento backend, and passes all validations, all plugins, all observers that are things that can modify that data. So it's the best way and the safest way. If something is wrong, you will know. It won't get inserted, and that's preventing getting trash data into the database. That's why we are saying that is the best way to go. The learning curve might be the highest one, because you need people who knows how to interact with the APIs. Also, you might need for certain extensions or new tables created by another extensions. You will need to create maybe the API for that data to be exposed, because not all the vendors, not all the people create that API folder, and it's not normal. It's normal to have many extensions that doesn't allow to get the data or set the data that way.
So there might be cases where you have fields that aren't naturally exposed to the API. You might have to do extra work to expose them to the API if possible. And that's interesting. That I would say from a security standpoint, there's also always questions about, any time that you're opening up access, whether to the database or to other areas of the site, that, you know, there's more security perhaps with some methodologies than others, like going through the API, where you know, where as opposed to maybe direct to database, you know, so that's certainly you know,
yeah, it's safest to give credentials to the API than to give credentials to the database, for sure.
Yeah, and I love how you described how basically the API is talking or responding similarly to how the Magento admin would. So if you go to put, let's say, you know, special characters in a field where they don't belong, that should be text only or numbers only, you know, numerics, you know, that it's going to give you an appropriate response. It's not going to let you put the wrong thing in the wrong place.
Yeah, because Magento has validations that are on top of the database, meaning that they have extra validations before putting the data in the database. The data validation in the database will be, don't put this type of input in this because it doesn't go there, but it's not very good to erase all the problems. So you end up having values that don't correspond to where they are put, but passing to Magento, that won't be allowed. Basically, they will stop you and say, this is an error, fix it.
You know, and Ryan, I would suppose that, you know, we've talked about how if someone doesn't use the API, it's often because they're not as familiar, or because it's going to be more work than maybe using an existing flat file or something that they think they can get done faster. Obviously, nChannel exists to move data for folks. Have you seen, you know, some interesting cases, you know, where even tangentially, where, you know, folks didn't know that there were services that already had those connections written for them, where they were doing it the hard way, or you know, had certainly headaches because they didn't know what was possible, that there are service providers like nChannel out there?
Yeah, a lot of the times we're replacing either a manual process, somebody's manually using a database script or an importer to update data on a regular basis, but there's human intervention required, or we're replacing sort of a homegrown integration add-on or customization of some sort. What people tend to not realize if they don't do integration or large-scale data movement on a regular basis, and this kind of plays into both, you know, how you integrate, but also when you're looking at API versus database versus the file importer exporter. One of the most important things you really need to understand is, what is your risk of exceptions? And I don't mean exceptions in the technical, like, coding sense. I mean exceptions as in, I'm trying to put this thing in times 1,000,000, and of the 500 that don't make it, those are exceptions. They didn't go down the happy path of successfully entering. Exception management's one of the most important things you need to consider. And the two things that increase your risk of exceptions are lots of data and automation of data, because you're doing things over and over and over again. So it's lots of data just spread over time. Your API tends to be your best tool for managing exceptions, because it's able to give you actionable error messages. It's able to validate the data and say, here's why I rejected it. It's invalid for this reason. Things like database scripts, you might have an exception or failure. You put it in the database wrong. You won't even know it until downstream something has blown up on you. And people who tend to build custom integrations don't necessarily always have the context to deal with those exceptions and whatever code they wrote, the right code for the happy path. And then when things start to blow up or not work, even 5% of the time, it's operationally a huge problem.
And so talking about things blowing up a bit, and hopefully then putting them back together better than they started, One-to-One e-commerce team was kind enough to put together some notes on one of their clients, the Lifeguard store. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about what you found here, and, you know, how following best practice was able to resolve issues and sort of you know, right the ship, not to be too punny with lifeguarding?
This is a fine example of a site that was beyond repair when we got it. The database for this site is huge. It was huge. We had many errors coming up when you're trying to save products, save attributes, like duplicated ID for key errors, things that pointed directly to the database. We started to look into the database and found many things that were not right there. but we had to fix one by one. It was months and months of work to iron out. And then the project got live, and we got more errors that we didn't see in developers, because when you are using the site every day, you get to see all the errors that you don't get to see in a developer's environment. So debugging this database particularly was very hard, and the client is hard to explain to the client what is a database inconsistency, what is trash data, why are they having these issues. And basically we trace it back to the previous agency that worked in the project, and the way they imported the data from I think it was WooCommerce, something like that, and they did whatever they could. They did it by a mixture of CSV and inserting directly to the database. Everything but using the API. We can see that the performance was terrible. The errors were everywhere. They were preventing the user to use the backend normally. And we started to debug error by error, deleting as we spotted something weird in the database, some record that shouldn't be there. And was really hard. And in that spot, after months of work, we are able now to say that it's stable. The database is stable and it's working fine. We are making sure that nothing gets added in a weird way again. And the client is very happy, because for the first time they don't find errors every day, and been that way for a long time now.
Yeah, it's tough to be a merchant, and you have a store, you want to operate a store. You don't necessarily want to be a tech company to face these kind of challenges, even when your developers come and tell you what they're discovering, to sometimes understand what that is and who's responsible, and take someone's word for it. It's always great when you are able to build stronger relationships with clients, and sort of partner with them as their outsourced team to solve these sorts of things. But from my experience, it's a challenge bringing people bad news, letting them know that their database isn't healthy, and that in some cases, you don't know exactly what it's going to take to solve the problems. That
very hard to
finding them. It's a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, there's a pretty good takeaway here for merchants as well, in terms of how they select their partners. I wasn't involved in this project at all, and I can see what happened here is that at some point through their process, this merchant probably worked with a partner who wasn't necessarily as capable of marrying the business requirements, like migrating a site over and how the site needs to look and work, with the technical problem solving. You end up with these kind of hacky database problems when somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing from a business perspective just gets in there and tries to solve the technical problem with whatever hack they can put together. And you can't be successful that way. So it's important to work with partners that understand the business implications of what they're doing, the long-term implications of what they're doing, so that you don't end up in this situation and have to have guys who are good, like 121 e-commerce, go in there and clean up the problem.
Yeah, and I think that to that point, one of the top reasons that folks go ahead and start writing direct to database is because that's what they're accustomed to, that they've been using, databases like MySQL for years and years, and they don't know the API as well. And so because they're not necessarily experts in Magento or in some of the best practices, they use their own path to least resistance. The same reason that it's not uncommon to see folks using or creating Magento extensions for functionality that's available off the shelf in Magento, that not quite enough research into methodology that you could have used. And so, you create problems where they didn't exist or need to exist. Certainly glad to hear that this client at this point has a healthy site, and always great to see when there is a success story out of that type of an issue. And with that, I want to say thank you to those that have tuned in for this video and podcast. And certainly, any final thoughts let's start with Chris.
Yeah, my final thought would be that sometimes it takes more time to get started to do things right at the beginning of the project instead of fixing it later. It ends up costing more when you do things to get it done and you do things badly and then you have to fix it. You may take more time starting a new project the right way and do it everything like it needs to be done, but at the end it will pay off always.
And Ryan?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and kind of building on what I just said about how you pick your partners. It should be your Magento agency's job to educate you on why they are recommending the best practice. But as a merchant, it's kind of your job to make sure you have a partner that you can trust and that is giving you good information, and to then trust what they say. If they're saying the best way to do this now, even if it takes a little bit more cost up front or a little bit more time up front, if they're educated and they know what they're doing, they're going to save you money and time over the long run. It's really the best way to do it, because technology problems that work their way in now become more and more complex down the road.
Sure. I mean, untangling either, spaghetti code, bad code that was created, or bad data can be a lot more work. In some cases, it becomes a money pit that in contractor terms, I've always said it's like being an electrician or a plumber. You take down the sheetrock, and every room that you go to, you find more problems behind the walls. And so at some point, it just becomes a rip out, that you don't know what you're going to find, and there's no great way to estimate it. So I would resonate with that always, measure twice, cut once. And sometimes that means spending a little bit more money up front. But as they say, you don't want to be, penny wise and dollar foolish. That, you want to be happy with your investment. It is an investment, that's for sure. And so with that, we look forward to bringing you more great information like this in the future. Thanks again for tuning in, and happy selling.